Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our EPAC webinar for December the 15th, called In Your Face, Ethics Issues in a Hiring Process. My name is Robert Cherney. I'm one of the directors of EPAC, and we'll wait a couple more minutes. I think there's one or two more people who had signed up, and so just bear with me now. We don't have opening music, unfortunately, or perhaps that's fortunate. Well, thank you very much. Let's get started. I want to honor the time of our presenter and of you people who've joined in today. So your hosts today are myself and Craig Irvin, the president of EPAC.
Welcome, everyone.
You're all using computer audio, I think. The voice lines are muted to reduce interference, and you can raise your hand to request speaking privilege. Please use the question box, or the Q&A box, I should say, for questions during the discussion. You can use the chat to share messages with other participants if you want, but we'll really be just monitoring the Q&A. The webinar is being recorded and it'll be on our website. And if you want to protect your privacy, then don't talk about your home, your department where you work. If you want, you can change your name in your attendee name. And we are always able to translate as we go along if necessary. But in terms of who's on the call today, I believe we're all members of EPAC, or most of us are, and Anglophones. So a quick word, and this is for the sake of the recording and not necessarily for the people who are attending just now. Our association promotes ethical practices in organizations and supports ethics practitioners across Canada, mainly by networking and educational opportunities like this webinar. And this is in pursuit of a vision of a world where people in organizations are ethically aware and act ethically. Please visit our website for the recordings, other resources, and of course to become a member, and encourage many other people to become members. Thank you. So we'll start with our friend Chris MacDonald, a former director of EPAC, who's been willing to help us in quite a few of our webinars. For example, last year, he participated, I think, in 2 or 3 that really focused on issues around organizations during the pandemic. And we may want to do more of those because unfortunately that's where we're still at, and I think issues are evolving. His main employment is as director of the Ted Rogers Leadership Center at Ryerson University, where he's taught for quite a few years. Before that, he was teaching in Halifax at Dalhousie, and he's also attached to some other universities, and is the co-author of 2 best-selling textbooks in the area of business ethics. And he is the main instigator of the online concise encyclopedia of business ethics, which I've looked at and I recommend to you. I think for Chris, business ethics and organizational ethics go hand in hand very nicely. Whoops, I went a bit too far. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to stop sharing now because it's over to Chris to share his screen.
Okay, thanks very much, Bob, and thanks for the invitation to come back and share some thoughts with the membership of EPAC. And I'm just going to share my screen here to start presenting what I'm here to present. The case we're looking at today was written a few years ago by my brilliant junior colleague, Haskell van Kriegstein, who teaches in my department. I teach in the Department of Law and Business at the Ted Rogers School of Management. I could have crammed that into my bio, but you heard enough about me, really. But though we are both members of the Department of Law and Business, we are both philosophers by training. So any legal considerations are going to be that we talk about here are going to be secondhand, though maybe there are lawyers in the audience. So this is a very short case, a teaching case that Haskell wrote a few years ago called In Your Face, a decision regarding privacy and technology in a hiring process. Now, it's part of an online collection of cases that the Ted Rogers Leadership Center, TRLC, has made freely available. I'll post that in the chat later, perhaps. I don't have, it's hard for me to post into the chat while I'm presenting. So, but it's easy enough to find if you Google Ted Rogers Leadership Center cases. We have a whole collection of both short and long cases on ethics and leadership. So here's what I'd like to talk about today. First, I'm going to do kind of a brief outline of the case, the details of the case. I'm sure you've all read it, but I'll do a quick reminder. Then I'll ask you some questions, and hopefully we can use the Q&A box to get some back and forth between us to get your insights into the case. I'm going to talk very briefly about the legality of the technology and the use of this technology outlined in the case. Again, that is secondhand, but it's worth pointing out. And then I'll present a bit of analysis of the case first in terms of what to think about the behavior of the central characters in this case, how to think about and what to conclude about their behavior, and then some considerations about what one might actually do in this situation, because ethics, the P in EPAC is for practitioners. So we know that ethics isn't just about thinking like we philosophers are inclined to do, but it's about doing, it's about practice, it's about what to do. Okay. And Bob, I'm going to leave it to you to monitor the Q&A, because it'll be challenging for me to get it onto my screen right now.
Will do.
So first, excuse me. First, a little outline of the case. In the case, it's written in the sort of the first person perspective. You are the founder and the CEO of the company. And it's a small software development company. The kind of software that the company itself develops isn't really relevant here necessarily. You and your most senior employee, Louis or Louis, depending on where Louis or Louis is from, are responsible for the hiring process, and you're in the process of scaling up, of hiring a largish number of software developers. And you're conducting interviews by video. The case says Skype because that was the video technology all of us knew 4 years ago when this was written. Maybe more likely Zoom or Teams or something like that today. And the crux of the case is that Louis secretly implements an image enhancement and analysis software that he says allows the user to read the emotions and detect lying on the part of the interviewee, on the part of the person at the other end of the video line. But then you, as CEO and founder of the company, find out, you discover what Louis has been up to kind of midway through the interview process. You've got 1 day of interviews behind you, you've got another day of interviews ahead of you, and now you find out. So here are my questions for you, and I am going to wait through even uncomfortably long pauses for silence to get some feedback from you. So first question, and this is kind of there'll be a bunch of answers to this. What are the ethical issues raised by Louis' behavior? And there might be, so feel free to suggest one-word answers, right? Like a particular value, or suggest a principle, something that's a longer and has a noun and a verb and something like that. So what are the ethical issues? They can even be questions. What are the ethical issues raised by Louis' behavior? I see there's something in the chat, but I can't see what it is.
Yes, transparency is certainly one of them.
Transparency, great. While I'm waiting for the next comment, I'm actually going to unshare my slides to see if I can get my cursor to appear. That way I can find the chat. There's a couple though in the Q&A, Bob. Okay,
experimenting with a new tool is another issue. By new tool, it's it said that this is a beta version. A third comment, right. Shouldn't the interviewers have a right to know they're using this software, letting them know that they're being recorded?
Okay, very good. Right, we want to know. Yeah, there's a question of the rights of the interviewee, right, as a participant in this process, and someone who's about whom you are divining information in principle. What else? And I'm not able to access the chat or Q&A right now, Bob, so I'll rely on you to read them out.
Yes. So those are the three in the Q&A, and
okay, there's also 4 in the chat apparently.
I've only seen 3. Sorry. Yes, here's the 4th one. Sorry, breach of trust. Okay, breach of trust. So you assume when you engage in a video format like this that what you see is what you see. I mean, I can see Bob's face. I can see where he's wearing glasses. I can see some books on a bookshelf behind him, and he has brought that much of his life into this professional context. But that's all I can see, and I assume that that's all Bob can see. He can see my face, my pandemic hair. He can say I'm wearing glasses, and he can see that I'm, in a home-like environment rather than an institutional environment. But other than that, I assume that Bob can't read my emotions any more than all of us are used to sort of reading each other's emotions with our body language and so on. Anything else, or is that? I'd like to add a variation on the term trust, and that's the trust between Louis and the owner. Very good. Louis has not been transparent with the owner, and I think, to my mind, because I'm thinking as the owner, I would find that really, really troubling in terms of my future relationship.
Right,
Craig,
and presumably here that.
Sorry, Craig, you're unmuted. Did you want to add something?
I just noticed consent was added in the chat as well.
Right. So, yeah. So question 1A, are there leadership issues connected to or separate from, the ethical issues? So leadership and ethics are closely connected in institutional settings, organizational settings, but are there specific leadership issues you'd want to bring out here? And presumably the one Bob just mentioned is one of them. So the relationship between Louis and you, the CEO, I mean, you are both a boss and an owner, which are separate kinds of relationships, and potentially if he's your most senior employee, maybe your friends too. So there's a lot bundled into that relationship. But are there other leadership issues? And if not, that's fine. But it's one I always want to try and tease out when there's a power relationship and a leadership relationship, whether that is implicated in the case.
I'll just chime in and suggest maybe there's a disconnect in understanding what the hierarchy of the organization is, or even the procedures and processes that are in place, if indeed there are any in place, and if indeed that kind of structure has been developed. We don't know, right? But it seems that there's a lack of clarity around all of that. Right,
very good. Yeah, I think whether it's merely a misunderstanding by Louis or actually a failure of you, the CEO, there is some kind of disconnect there, right? You could back up a step and sort of ask, well, who are the stakeholders here and what do they have at stake? In most kinds of rigorous ethical decision-making, we want to think about who is involved, who cares, whose interests or rights are affected. And we'll give you the obvious one, right? The interviewees clearly are affected. Are there any other, I mean, this is a fairly narrow case, but are there any other stakeholders that might have an interest here?
I'll just jump in while waiting for others to respond. But one of the things that I tend to think might be included under the stakeholder is the developer of the software, which Louis is using, which is a beta version, and was not developed by Louis, but was developed by somebody who was either working with or was a professor of Louis's.
Right. So it may well be that the person responsible for this software would be appalled at this. That might be an unintended use. It might be, it might be an unlicensed, and might be a violation of intellectual property and copyright or patent and so on. So all kinds of questions there, sure. Any other, there's some new stuff going on in the chat there.
Yes, shareholders of the company are stakeholders, if this was publicly revealed. Same thing, the investors, how does it reflect on them?
Right. So at this point, there may not be shareholders, but there is at least one major investor. We're told that in the case. And so they would have an interest. We might also even just going back to the my initial statement that there are, the obvious stakeholder here is the interviewees. So we might want to distinguish between the interviewees who have already been interviewed and the ones who are about to be interviewed, because they have similar but not identical interests, right? Because the ones who are about to be interviewed have not yet had their privacy breached. So I'm just trying to get back to, okay. So the next question is, what should you do next? What comes next? And I'm going to break this into two sub questions. One is, what should you do regarding the interviews, right? So this thing has happened and you've got a fairly immediate crisis on your hands. You're literally in the middle of the interview process. What should you do about the interviews? What should you do about in the moment? And then I'll have a separate question that has to do with the organization going forward. Anyone?
I wonder if I could just roll back for a moment as people consider that
Sure.
question and just go back to under 1A and 2, leadership and stakeholders. It occurs to me that perhaps the other employees, although it's a small organization, there's a couple of other employees who are going to be affected by this circumstance. And that effect is going to influence the culture, whatever that culture is, what stage it's at. But however it looks now, it's going to look differently because of this situation. So that becomes an interesting dynamic in and of itself that links to both the leadership perspective and the stakeholder component.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Craig. And excuse me, it's worth keeping in mind that this is a startup. And as I gave a presentation recently to a bunch of people who were interested in the ethics of startups. And I said to them, you are already becoming the company you will someday be. The choices you make now are building the values that will someday be part of your corporate culture when you are, big and competing with Google. And so, yeah, the choices that both Louis and the CEO make here are going to affect what kind of company the rest of us in the company work in a year from now. We're either going to be a company that really, really emphasizes privacy, or we're going to be a company that de-emphasizes, shall we say, that aspect. So what should we do about the interviews? What should we do about the present moment, about the fact that we have, Louis, but maybe we should separate those. Louis has done this, we have done this, the company has done it at some level, regarding the fact that this has gone on and the fact that we have this information. So what should we do? Anyone?
One person has said, I think the interviews could still be used for screening if the technology is discarded. In other words, do not use the recording and analysis from the software.
Okay. All right. That seems like a plausible point of view. Keeping in mind that Louis has already disclosed a couple of pieces of information that may well be difficult to forget. I mean, you can try your best, but you now know that Louis believes that one person was lying and that another person was very nervous about her motives for applying for the job. So, but beyond that would, I think, would be a plausible option. Any others? Any other thoughts about what should be done at this point? And feel free to float ideas that are not dearest to your heart. I mean, we should explore a range of things from the squeaky clean to the playing closer to the edge, because I think in any robust discussion within an organization, you need to put all those options on the table. Anyone?
The person says, I agree with that approach, but Louis is tainted. Do you need a different interviewer? And I think that even if a marking scheme is in place, this situation is already tainted.
Okay. All right. Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so it may well be that Louis, two things. One may be that Louis as an interviewer may need to be moved out, and the second is that the process itself might need to be unwound. So what are you going to, what if anything, are there other comments, or shall I prompt here?
Something just occurred to me.
Yeah.
This might be expensive for this firm, but these are the preliminary interviews. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to do, you know, several dozen in 2 days. These must be very, very short interviews.
Yeah.
And so just take everybody from day one and include them in day two. Include them in the next stage. In other words, say, you know, we didn't really pay.
Right.
We had a brain fart, okay, and
Right.
We don't want to disadvantage you because of that. Therefore, you're going to be taken in the next stage.
Right. So that, yeah, that's, I mean, that's an interesting option, because it's a way of saying, look, we worry that you were disadvantaged, and to make sure that you're not. Of course, now you're going to give them an advantage that they may not deserve either, but that might be better than giving them a disadvantage they don't deserve. But of course, this, if you're going to communicate that, this raises the question of, well, what are you going to tell them exactly? I mean, one, are you going to tell them anything, right? Two, what exactly? I think a lot of people who I've talked to about this case have the intuition that we should tell them something, we should disclose something. But there's maybe a bit more disagreement about, well, some people think, well, no, there's nothing to disclose here. There's no harm done. But if you think should be some kind of disclosure, what should you disclose? How much? Are there any thoughts on that? Complete disclosure, or should there be sort of a, you know, there was a technical glitch, we need to redo your interview? What are you going to tell these interviewees, regardless of whether you take up Bob's suggestion that they all be interviewed in person next?
And it's interesting in asking or posing that question that it links back to what kind of company do you want this to be going forward? That's going to inform and influence whatever response comes next, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly. So what kind of company? This is one of those moments where, to me, it's not as clear that there is a perfect ethical answer, but it is clear to me exactly what you said, Craig, that this is kind of an existential moment, that you're deciding what kind of company you are, right? And I say that without even presuming that one kind of company is better or not. I just said this is a defining moment, right? So, and anyone voting for full disclosure, you should tell them absolutely everything. We used beta software to violate your privacy.
Chris, I think that you just defined something very interesting. A perfect ethical dilemma is one for which there is no perfect ethical answer.
Right.
Right.
Go ahead, Bob.
There was a comment a little earlier. I think you would need to agree to strike the notes taken related to the interview software. This may be very difficult to ignore. May have to rely only on the notes and impressions of the one not using the software. So we've talked about that. There's a couple more comments here. I'm naively going to suggest we go with complete disclosure, but could there be bad consequences to full disclosure? And finally, remove Louis from this process. Identify to those interviewed that you're bringing them back for another interview and essentially start over with totally new set of questions.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. I think those are all very plausible and you know, ethically meaningful. So the next question I want to pose is this one. So let's say you get through this. What are you going to do about Louis? I mean, Louis has done something here that you don't approve of. I'll try and say it as neutrally as I can, because that much is built into the case. You don't approve of what Louis has done. What next? What about Louis? Now that let's put the hiring process behind us. We've already said that he's likely to be excluded from the hiring process. What do we do about him in the longer term? And I can think of many, many answers here. And so can you, because your imaginations are just as good as mine.
So one of the responses is use the software on him as we are informing, oh, I just lost it, as we are informing them why they are losing their job, or not being considered for the job, perhaps because they have not yet had a job to lose in this case. But yeah, interesting.
Right. So use this on Louis. Is that the point? Because Louis certainly has a
Yes.
job to lose. He's an employee. Okay. So
yeah, that might be inferred that to use it on Louis, and make his responses resonate with whether or not he remains employable.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, we'll get to the legality of that one on the next slide. But that's one option. Okay. What else? What else?
One of our attendees has raised her hand, so I'll just hit allow to talk. And would you like to speak now, or was that just some in error?
That's okay. I was raising my hand because Chris was asking who was in favor of full disclosure. So I thought that was a good way of voting for it.
Okay.
But since I'm here, I'm just going to point out that I think it would be worth talking to Louis about what he did, why he did it, why I don't agree. I like to think of these things as teaching opportunities rather than let's just fire him.
Right.
But of course, depending on how he took that talk, then, we might have to go with that kind of disciplinary action. But I'd be willing to give him a try. I would say, he meant well, just his ethics are probably skewed, but, he just might not have thought of it that way. So that's my 2 bits. Thanks.
Okay, very good. So I think interrogating his thinking is a really important point, right? Like, I mean, both in terms of, frankly, Louis' own growth and professional development, but also to try to understand. I mean, just to be open-minded here, it might well be that you're overreacting here. Maybe he has really sound ethical thinking underneath this. My intuition is no, but it would be good to understand more about what he's thinking for sure. Anything else?
That's an interesting point, because as we're talking about this, I'm thinking in terms of the way that the narrative is explained. It's not at all clear that Louis believes that he's done anything wrong or unethical. It's not clear in the wording that is the case. So and it didn't really dawn on me your point that perhaps he has some pretty solid rationale for why he proceeded the way he did. We are not privy to what that is, but on the other hand, we're also not privy as to just how much knowledge he has or self-awareness about, now that this is kind of blown up, why it's blown up and what his part in it is. So it's a curious question.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think in this particular case, I think most of us have a pretty strong intuition that something fishy went on here. This was not okay. But we also tend to have that same impression in other cases where it isn't so clear. Most of us are pretty quick to jump to conclusions. We tend to, despite our commitment to the idea that I'm going to gather the facts, engage in some ethical assessment, and then come to a conclusion. Most of us do it the exact opposite way, right? We jump to a conclusion and then we try and marshal facts and analysis that support it in spite of ourselves. And so I think this is an example where we want to do that kind of discussion, even though we think we're pretty sure.
I'd like to raise something else. The text, I think, has an interesting, subtle point. Louis is embarrassed when the owner comes in and sees that he's installing this software. So yeah, as we just, someone's writing, Louis is uncomfortable about getting caught with the USB key. So I think he kind of knew he was doing something wrong. But then when the owner pursues this with him, were you actually using it yesterday? Yes, I was. And guess what? It really worked. So at first he's embarrassed, and then he's proud. And I think that, I'm far beyond the point where I have employees and had to deal with these sorts of things. But I think it's a worthwhile thing to talk about, dealing with naive employees. And
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's just right. I mean, the story is written that Louis is your most senior. The text says oldest, but the implication is most senior, not oldest in age. Is your most senior employee, but this could have been a brand new employee, right? This could have been someone who is too junior to be part of the interview process, but is handling the technology, is setting up the Zoom, setting up the Skype, and so on. So in which case, it might genuinely be someone who's fresh out of school, really hasn't had a lot of background in these kinds of issues. And so I think that's a good point, Bob. So let me just proceed with a bit of additional analysis, but people can feel free to chime in as we go along. So first, this question, is this legal? And I pointed out at the very beginning that I am not a lawyer, but when Hosco first wrote this case, I took it to a colleague who is a privacy expert, a lawyer who is a privacy expert, a scholar in the area of privacy law in Canada. And his clear answer was no way, this is entirely illegal. Is that Canadian, I said labor law, but I mean, labor law and privacy law intersect here. You're just not allowed to do this without people's consent. And it's not even, my recollection is foggy, but I'm not even sure you could do it with people's consent, because it's just such, it's a coercive context. When someone is up for an interview, you just as you can't ask them questions about, are you married and are you straight or gay and stuff like that. So yes, as Paul said, I can see the chat now. As Paul said, this is kind of akin to recording someone secretly. And in fact, we don't know, that part is left out of the case. We don't know whether the Skype or Zoom was recorded. So it's pretty clear that this is legal. Now I left the illegal. I left this part till now because as a philosopher and ethicist, I always want to be clear that legal stuff matters clearly, but it's not the whole thing. If we start with the legality, then it kind of begs the question. It kind of, for a lot of people, it will be, the rest of the answer will seem clear based on the legal answer, and that's not always the case, because law and ethics are overlapping circles, but they're not the same thing. So let me say just a little bit more about Louis' behavior ethically, and my goal here is to nudge understanding rather than to force a conclusion. I don't have any interest in telling either any of the participants in this webinar or the CEO of this company what to do. As I often say when I am consulted by organizations or leaders struggling with issues, look, I'm just here for a few minutes. I'm going home tomorrow. You have to deal with this situation. I don't. So really, I want to help foster understanding rather than provide a conclusion. So, in terms of Louis' behavior towards the interviewees, there's a bunch of stuff to think about, most of which we've already touched on. There's a violation of the moral or ethical right to privacy, which again is separate from the legal question, right? So even were it the case that Canadian law allowed this sort of thing, you could probably make a pretty good argument that there was a violation of people's ethical right to privacy or moral right to privacy. Philosophers tend to use those words interchangeably. It's also a violation of trust, right? So when I come onto a video and turn my camera on, I'm engaging in a certain amount of, putting a certain amount of trust, especially in this kind of context where there's a power dynamic. I'm the interviewee, you're the interviewer, you're the company that I desperately want to work for in a tough job market. And so that's important. There's the question of deception. And of course, in this case, the deception is a special kind. It's a lie of omission. At no point did Louis say, oh, by the way, we are not analyzing your emotions through sophisticated technology. He simply never said anything about it, but in that sense, deceived the interviewees. There's also this question, which I don't think came up yet, which is, this is beta software. Is this software reliable enough to produce valid outputs? And we're seeing all kinds of stories on nearly a daily basis these days about the validity of everything from facial recognition software to facial analysis software and other kinds of biometrics. This is not a product that was on the market. This was not something that Louis went to Best Buy to purchase. This was something that was still being tested. And so it may well be that the results are unreliable, which compounds the problem, right? Not only are you violating my privacy, you're doing so in a way that might wrongly tag me as deceptive, as a liar. And then finally, does the software embody any racial or gender biases, which again is is kind of one of the big concerns people have talked about in terms of facial analysis software, because as the saying goes, garbage in, garbage out, and these systems have to be trained. They have to be trained up to recognize certain kinds of physiological features. And if the training is bad, then the result is going to be bad. And so it may well be that, what if the software was trained up on exclusively light-skinned faces, it's going to it may well read darker skinned faces very differently, for better or for worse, and we just won't know in advance. And then there's the question of Louis' behavior vis-a-vis his boss and company. And pretty clearly there was a violation of chain of command here. He did not have the authority to do this. He did not have the authority to do this on behalf of the company. And really, Louis may well be, there's a subtle legal question here about whether Louis' behavior would count as the behavior of the company. But in case that it did, then there would certainly be, and there probably is anyway, some legal jeopardy. Out of a dozen interviewees, somebody is going to raise hell about this, and recognizing that their legal rights have been violated. And so Louis has put the company at enormous risk, I would say. And I'm in terms of the law, I'm an informed amateur, but I sense a lot of legal jeopardy here, and it's a huge issue for an employee to put a company at risk. That's one of the places where the law clearly becomes relevant, because you have a clear ethical obligation not to put your company at huge legal risk. Now, some people, of course, maybe no one on this call, but some people will say, look, but what's the harm? They didn't hurt anyone. Nobody was, as far as we know, nobody was wrongly accused of lying. And that's kind of the classic question, right? And philosophers tend to cash this out in terms of, we all want to pursue good outcomes. You want to do what's best for your company. You want to try and promote the interests of your employer. But on the other hand, we want to respect rights and duties. And this is kind of one of the it's not the only, but it's one of the major clashes of values or principles that comes about when we talk about ethics. On the one hand, we want to produce good outcomes, but on the other hand, we want to respect the rights of other people and the duties that we have to them. The other way this is sometimes put is, do the ends justify the means? So Louis had good intentions here, let's assume. He wanted the best person for the job. He wanted an honest person. He wanted someone who was giving honest answers. But the means he used, the methods he used, were ones that we will tend to think violated people's rights. In general, of course, the ends do sometimes justify the means. As others have said, if the ends don't justify your means, what do? I mean, outcomes matter. Consequences of our actions matter. But we tend to think of the ends justifying the means when the ends are highly valuable and preferably uncontroversially valuable, and when the means are minimally invasive, right? So if the need is desperate enough, right? You're trying to end a war, and if you bomb the munitions factory, some civilians are going to get killed. The end there, ending the war, is may well be put forward as sufficient to justify means that are admittedly regrettable. But you want means that are minimally invasive and proportional to the goodness of the ends that are being sought. So is this one of those cases? Probably not. The ends here are not uncontroversial. They are not clearly going to be achieved. And the violation here is probably pretty substantial. So what to do about the interviews, assuming that a wrong has been done, and we've kind of gone over a bit of this, noting, of course, that a larger organization, and certainly organizations like universities and banks, right, we have policies that dictate quite explicitly what has to be done in these cases. If this were a bank and these were mortgage customers or something like that, then I'm pretty sure, if anyone works at a bank, they can chime in, but I'm almost positive they would have a very strong legal obligation to just full disclosure. And at the university, it would be similar. So should the interviewees be notified? We've already chatted about that. And I think the key question really is more, how much should you tell them? You probably need to disclose something. I have mixed feelings myself about whether full and utter disclosure is absolutely necessary, given the amount of legal jeopardy here, and that you might well be able to nullify the wrong, most of the wrong, by getting rid of the data and starting fresh somehow. Should the interviews be redone, or is deleting the info possible? Is it sufficient? I'm not sure. Probably, though, I think you're going to want to disclose and start over. But we still have this question about, should disclosure be complete, or should it just be something? Are you showing sufficient respect by disclosing, look, that we had a problem here? What to do about Louis? I think this is an interesting one. I mean, this was a serious ethical breach, a serious breach of the chain of command, and I think some of the key options. I think certainly it's plausible that you'd want to fire Louis. This was, a fairly grave offense in terms of the ethics of it, but also a grave offense in terms of his loyalty to the company, or his misplaced expression of his loyalty to the company, I think. You could also show that you are loyal to your company by slashing the tires of your competitors, but that's a very misguided kind of loyalty. You might, now the HR experts out there, or the people out there who know more about HR, will have a lot more options in mind. There's all kinds of things that large, sophisticated organizations will have in mind. You could suspend Louis for a week without pay to impress upon him the seriousness of this. You could also, as one of you mentioned, interrogate his reasoning. You could engage in a dialogue, engage in a discussion. You could also send Louis for privacy training. Clearly, Louis doesn't understand something about privacy law and about respect for people's privacy. But of course, this also raises the question of whether you should have privacy training for everybody. Maybe you need it too. You have recognized, of course, that there's a breach here, but it might also make you realize that you're not entirely sure about the legality and about the wherefores in the house. So there are some questions of training, and of course, those of us who are fans of organizational ethics will recognize this as a moment where it might be, it's not always time for a policy, and one violation doesn't always mean you need a policy. But it might well be that you need a privacy policy and or a code of ethics. And I just want to point out that it might well be that the conversation, the internal conversation around creating a policy or a code might be as important as the document that you end up with. Right. So the process of saying, look, folks, we're going to shut down the office for half a day and talk about privacy, maybe bring in someone to facilitate, that's going to be as valuable as actually having a written document at the end of things. Last thing I want to present before turning it back to discussion is this. Could this happen? Does anyone think that this is this science fiction? Probably in some sense that it's not entirely sci-fi. This doesn't have to take place in the year 2200 or anything like that. I'll answer my own question with a press release from the University of Toronto. This is a press release from U of T from a few years ago about a researcher named Kang Lee, who produced a video software that was primarily intended to help health analysis. Right, so we could at this moment be checking Bob's cardiac health by assessing the blood flow in his face. But in another part of the release, Kang also mentioned that he liked to use this software when he was chatting with his parents by video, because he said sometimes they don't really disclose what's going on with their health. And so I like to turn on the software and find out whether they're telling the truth or not. Of course, that within a family context, that's very different from an organizational context, but not necessarily entirely innocent either. But this is just a way of saying that this is the same sort of thing. And yeah, as Megan says, it is in the same vein as HR searching someone's social media profiles. Though I suspect by now every applicant knows that HR may be out there looking at their Twitter feed. They are much less likely to know that, or to think that HR might be using video analysis software on them, though that will increasingly be a possibility, as this press release points out. Anyway, that's all I've got to say. Are there other issues people want to raise? Are there, Bob or Craig or anyone on the call?
Yeah, I just want to, respond to, could this happen? I believe it is happening as we speak. So there's been recent articles in Forbes, for example, and Technology the MIT publication Technology Online, or Technology Review at MIT, where they actually did, critical analysis on whether tools like these kinds of technologies, how accurate they are and how reliable they are. And this was recently, this was this year in 2021. And in the tests that they were able to conduct, they found that these technologies really aren't that robust, although they're widely used, especially in hiring people in the technology sector. So, although we don't come across this as much in North America, at least up to this point, certainly in Asia and other countries in Europe, this is something that's becoming a regular feature of the hiring process, where you will have an avatar conduct the interview using AI and machine learning algorithms to determine whether or not you move on to the next stage.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's obviously going to be more of a concern where privacy law is lax, but it's also a concern where privacy law is simply ignored, or I don't want to be cynical about smaller companies, but bigger companies are more likely to have a robust policy and training and things like that. And a smaller company might well feel like they need to skirt the issue a bit.
There's a couple of remarks in the chat, but perhaps everybody is reading them anyway, about this being quite common. It can absolutely happen because biometrics are currently being used to do facial recognition, iris scanning, and other physical attributes. Think about lie detector tests and physical responses. There are specialists who do analysis criminal interviews that identify changes in eye movement, expressions, and so on. So definitely can be built into today's IA technology. Another person, I've seen a great increase in headhunters being hired to raid employees of other companies. And at first glance makes me wonder how far they will stretch the limits of ethics in order to achieve their goals as good recruiters. I didn't know about that. And a compliment, interesting topic, great discussion on it. Thanks, Chris. And the others. I'd like to add my own comment. This goes back to questions about possible biases. The reason Lyra may have become anxious during the interview was because of her expectations that if she was disclosing everything about her plans, then she might run into typical biases against women who might become pregnant and therefore aren't doing solely what the company wants. Okay, so what this means to me, and I think this is a naive response on my part, but anyway, even if this was just a face-to-face interview and someone stammered or hesitated or looked around, kind of had some sort of change in body language in response to a question, I would say you seem to want to say a little bit more. Do you want to expand on that? Use these biometrics, in other words, because that's non-machine biometrics that I just described. Right. Use biometrics as the clue that there's more there than we've already heard. And that's all. But don't make the judgment based on that thing. Just use it as a clue to ask more. I do have one other example which actually happened to me. This was in the context of responding to an RFP about training and culture issues in communications for interviewers in a legal context. And I was told, in effect, that people who don't look you straight in the eye are always lying. And this was in Canada, where we have cultures where it's impolite to look somebody straight in the eye. I was absolutely dumbfounded. And so when you said, Chris, before about a bias being built in for, darker skin is emotionally troubled skin, you know, there's quite a few variations on that. Larger larger accounting firms now are rating smaller ones. Yeah.
That's probably always been true.
Yeah.
One of the other things I wanted to mention as a kind of a point of imagination, perhaps because I'm stretching the narrative that was presented a little bit here, is it conceivable that Louis, being the the employee who's been with the organization or the small company the longest, along with the owner, was one of the reasons why the funder, the person who has put up the money, the venture capitalist, has provided the seed funding that they currently have. If indeed the consideration is to release Louis, does that mean the funding disappears with Louis? Because there's, again, I'm reading a lot in here, so we have to kind of consider that perhaps he is the most technologically enabled of the group, at least as far as the presentation goes, and that might be the key point for a venture capitalist to invest, is because now this is scaling up to be a technologically enabled company. So therefore, is it a careful consideration around what happens next, that possibly the funding could disappear if the wrong decision is made?
Right. So venture capitalists sometimes, I think I've heard some say that they don't just invest in companies or products, they invest in teams. And if Louis is a key member of this team, yeah, he may well be the technological brains behind this thing, which would be troubling. But it's a fair thing to take into consideration, I think.
Yeah. Just another kind of thought experiment. I know it's kind of outside of the boundaries of what we're looking at here, but it's an interesting consideration.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody else wants to speak, you could actually use the raise hand symbol on your screen. It might be it would be at the bottom either as raise hand, or click on reactions, and it would be at the bottom of reactions. And I'm curious whether anybody has actually been in this situation of in effect, an employee who's rogue in terms of the organization's either written or unwritten policies, and has to be kind of set straight, and maybe other consequences from that. Okay, go ahead, Paul. You can speak now.
You can hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, well, certainly I've seen this in my experience in my career, public service. And yes, there has been occasions where employees will go rogue to chase the goals of the organization and start working outside the bounds of ethics. And that is one of the things that I've seen in the past that can actually have someone terminated, depending on the lengths that they have gone to do that. But certainly it is a, I wouldn't say common, but it is a reoccurring issue that within the government, especially in terms of chasing goals. But of course, it'd be the same for companies as well. But I definitely have seen this many times. That's all I have.
Thank you, Paul. I was working in a unit one summer. We needed a temporary, in effect, bookkeeper. And this gentleman had a very relaxed manner about him, but we weren't the sort of people who kind of hovered and watched employees working all the time. I found out at the end of the summer that he had actually never done anything, but all the work got done because he brought the stuff home and got his wife to do it overnight. So you can have various sorts of rogue behavior. Feynman had said, good point, Craig, to your last stuff about the venture capitalists. It's always easier to make an ethical decision when it's not going to sink your bottom line. Yeah.
Well, I think my last point, I mean, I'm not, it's not my job to close the session, but I just want to say as my kind of closing thought that I really think that just want to go back to a point I made partway through my presentation, which is that, you know, the point of looking at a case like this isn't necessarily to think specifically about privacy or specifically, let alone about privacy law, but to start to think about the process of how it is that you think through a case like this. And, you know, legal analysis is one thing and HR analysis is another thing. And your organization may provide guidelines for how to think about an ethical issue, and that might be built into your code of conduct, things like that. But it's the practice of thinking about this and thinking about it in as close to a first person kind of way, right? How would I, this is a really hard situation, I think, right? It's a defining moment for an organization and for a leader, right? I think that's one of the things that we could probably say a lot more about is the leadership angle here. So I'll leave that with you to think about as you go on to your afternoon. It can distract you through your afternoon of meetings.
I think, Chris, that this reminds me of a point I started forming in my head on one of your earlier screens. I think it was the screen where you were talking about the ends justifying the means. And what occurred to me was to ask, what kind of world do we want to live in? And I realize now that that's a form of the Kantian universalizability. What if everybody did this? Would you want to be in a world where everybody was in effect allowing themselves to take advantage of these sorts of things, or to generalize it better? Sorry, I'm thinking out loud here. We're dedicated to not being transparent, you know, and says, you know, I don't care, you know, this is an advantage to us, and don't ask these big fat airy-fairy questions about the whole world. You know, I'm just concerned about this. Well, yeah, we do have to ask questions about the whole world, and perhaps that's an elaboration on your challenge there, rather than an answer to the question. Craig,
Yeah,
any final thought?
I'd just like to say that you know, it's a tribute to the author of this case study, that it's you know, very brief. It's a very kind of brief composition, and yet there's, you know, such richness of, you know, areas that we could explore in this, as we've really kind of touched on the surface of a range of different topics, as you pointed out, Chris, earlier. So I think you know, these kinds of case studies are really value added just for in the manner that you spoke of, that they help us to organize our thinking around these kinds of things. They help us to think about the kinds of questions to ask and the kinds of things that matter to us in a practical way. So again, thanks for sharing that with us this afternoon.
Sure, my pleasure. And I will pass along your happy comments to Oscar.
Okay, and I'll go back to here we go. Where are we? Oh, come on. And here's our final screen. So if you would take a minute or two and go back to the question box and use it to rate the webinar. If you want, make suggestions about how we can improve our webinars and add to our topics for the future. I do hope that we'll have Chris on again, because I found this a really wonderful use. Craig has just complimented the text that we looked at, so I'd like to add, just as Rich, a thank you to Chris for this masterful guidance through the discussion. Chris has added the case archive to the chat area, so if you want to click in there and and copy that down. I think it's just great that the Ted Rogers Center under your leadership has decided to make these freely available. And I know that we've looked at others, other of the cases there and that have attracted us. So unfortunately for you and the use of your time, Chris, we'll be back, I'm sure.
Okay, no problem.
So send us a few comments, and in the meantime, thank you everybody for joining in on our last webinar of 2021. Please do join again in 2022 and keep EPAC going. Thank you for your participation. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.